Hey everybody, this is the final chapter of Negative Dialectics by Adorno. The final chapter of Negative Dialectics is in part 3 of Negative Dialectics. I don't know why I'm talking like that. Part 3 of Negative Dialectics is titled Models, and this chapter is titled Meditations on Metaphysics, which is chapter 3 of part 3. So, without further ado, let's go. First section. After Auschwitz. We cannot say any more that the immutable is truth, and that the mobile transitory is appearance. The mutable indifference of temporality, the mutual indifference of temporality and in eternal ideas is no longer tenable even with the bold Hegelian explanation that temporal existence, by virtue of the destruction inherent in its concept, serves the eternal represented by the eternity of destruction. One of the mystical impulses secularized in dialectics was the doctrine that the intramundane and historic is relevant to what traditional metaphysics distinguished as transcendence, or at least less gnostically and radically put, that it is relevant to the position taken by human consciousness on the questions which the canon of philosophy assigned to metaphysics. After Auschwitz, our feelings resist any claim of the positivity of existence as sanctimonious, as wronging the victims. They balk at squeezing any kind of sense, however bleached, out of the victim's fate, and these feelings do have an objective side after events that make a mockery of the construction of immanence, as endowed with a meaning radiated by an affirmatively posited transcendence. Such a construction would affirm absolute negativity and would assist its ideological survival, as in reality that negativity survives anyway, in the principle of society as it exists until its self-destruction. The earthquake of Lisbon sufficed to cure Voltaire of the theodicy of Leibniz, and the visible disaster of the first nature was insignificant in comparison with the second social one, which defies human imagination as it distills a real hell from human evil. Our metaphysical faculty is paralyzed because actual events have shattered the basis on which speculative metaphysical thought could be reconciled with experience. Once again, the dialectical motif of quantity recoiling into quality scores an unspeakable triumph. The administrative murder of millions made of death a thing one had never yet to fear in just this fashion. There is no chance any more for death to come into the individual's empirical life as somehow conformable with the course of that life. The last, the poorest possession left to the individual is expropriated. That in the concentration camps it was no longer an individual who died, but a specimen. This is a fact bound to affect the dying of those who escape the administrative measure. Genocide is the absolute integration. It is on its way wherever men are leveled off, quote, polished off, end quote, as the German military called it, until one exterminates them literally, as deviations from the concept of their total nullity. Auschwitz confirmed the philosophy of pure identity as death. The most far-out dictum from Beckett's Endgame, the book Endgame, or I guess the play, I don't know what Endgame is, I think it's a play, that there really is not so much to be feared anymore, reacts to a practice whose first sample was given in the concentration camps, and in whose concept, venerable once upon a time, the destruction of non-identity is ideologically lurking. Absolute negativity is in plain sight and has ceased to surprise anyone. Fear used to be tied to the principium individuationis, of self-preservation, and that principle by its own consistency abolishes itself. What the sadists in the camps foretold their victims, quote, "Tomorrow you'll be wiggling skyward as smoke from this chimney," end quote, bespeaks the different indifference of each individual life that is the direction of history. Even in his formal freedom, the individual is as fungible and replaceable as he will be under the liquidator's boots. But since, in a world whose law is universal individual profit, the individual has nothing but this self that has become indifferent, the performance of the old, familiar tendency is at the same time the most dreadful of things. There is no getting out of this, no more than out of the electrified barbed wire around the camps. Perennial suffering has as much right to expression as a tortured man has to scream. Hence it may have been wrong to say that after Auschwitz you could no longer write poems. But it is not wrong to raise the less cultural question whether after Auschwitz you can go on living, especially whether one who escaped by accident, one who by rights should have been killed, may go on living. His mere survival calls for the coldness, the basic principle of bourgeois subjectivity, without which there could have been no Auschwitz. This is the drastic guilt of him who is spared. By way of atonement, he will be plagued by dreams such as that he is no longer living at all, that he was sent to the ovens in 1944, and his whole existence since has been imaginary, an emanation of the insane wish of a man killed 20 years earlier. Thinking men and artists have not infrequently described a sense of being not quite there, of not playing along, a feeling as if they were not themselves at all, but a kind of spectator. Others often find this repulsive. It was the basis of Kierkegaard's polemic against what he called the aesthetic sphere. A critique of philosophical personalism indicates, however, that this attitude towards immediacy, this disavowal of every existential posture, has a moment of objective truth that goes beyond the appearance of the self-preserving motive. Quote, "What does it really matter," end quote, is a line we like to associate with bourgeois callousness, but it is the line most likely to make the individual aware, without dread, of the insignificance of his existence. The inhuman part of it, the ability to keep one's distance as a spectator and to rise above things, is in the final analysis the human part, the very part resisted by its ideologists. It is not altogether implausible that the immortal part is the one that acts in this fashion. The scene of Shaw on his way to the theater, showing a beggar his identification with the hurried remark, quote, "Press," end quote, hides a sense of that beneath the cynicism. It would help to explain the fact that startled Schopenhauer that affections in the face of death, not only other people's but our own, are frequently so feeble. People, of course, are spellbound without exception, and none of them are capable of love, which is why everyone feels loved too little. But the spectator's posture simultaneously expresses doubt that this could be all, when the individual, so relevant to himself and his delusion, still has nothing but that poor and emotionally animal-like ephemerality. Spellbound, the living have a choice between involuntary ataraxy, an aesthetic life due to weakness, and the bestiality of the involved. Both are wrong ways of living, but some of both will be required for the right désinvolture and sympathy. Once overcome, the culpable self-preservation urge has been confirmed precisely perhaps by the threat that has come to be ceaselessly present. The only trouble with self-preservation is that we cannot help suspecting the life to which it attaches us of turning into something that makes us shudder, into a specter, a piece of the world of ghosts, which our waking consciousness perceives to be non-existent. The guilt of a life which purely as a fact will strangle other life, according to statistics that eke out an overwhelming number of killed, with a minimal number of rescued, as if this were provided in the theory of probabilities. This guilt is irreconcilable with living, and the guilt does not cease to reproduce itself, because not for an instant can it be made fully presently conscious. This, nothing else, is what compels us to philosophize. And in philosophy we experience a shock. The deeper, the more vigorous its penetration, the greater our suspicion that philosophy removes us from things as they are. That an unveiling of the essence might enable the most superficial and trivial views to prevail over the views that aim at the essence. This throws a glaring light on truth itself. In speculation we feel a certain duty to grant the position of a corrective to common sense, the opponent of speculation. Life feeds the horror of a premonition. What must come to be known may resemble the down to earth more than it resembles the sublime. It might be that this premonition will be confirmed even beyond the pedestrian realm, although the happiness of thought, the promise of its truth, lies in sublimity alone. If the pedestrian had the last word, if it were the truth, truth would be degraded. The trivial consciousness, as it is theoretically expressed in positivism and unreflected nominalism, may be closer than the sublime consciousness to an adequatio re atque cogitationis. Its sneering mockery of truth may be truer than a superior consciousness, unless the formation of a truth concept other than that of adequatio should succeed. The innovation that metaphysics might win only by discarding itself applies to such other truth, and it is not the last among the motivations for the passage to materialism. We can trace the leaning into it from the Hegelian Marx to Benjamin's rescue of induction. Kafka's work may be the apotheosis of the trend. If negative dialectics calls for the self-reflection of thinking, the tangible implication is that if thinking is to be true, if it is to be true today in any case, it must also be a thinking against itself. If thought is not measured by the extremity that eludes the concept, it is from the outset in the nature of the musical accompaniment with which the SS liked to drown out the screams of its victims. New section. Metaphysics and culture. A new categorical imperative is imposed by Hitler upon unfree mankind, to arrange their thoughts and actions so that Auschwitz will not repeat itself, so that nothing similar will happen. When we want to find reasons for it, this imperative is as refractory as the given one of Kant was once upon a time. Dealing discursively with it would be an outrage, for the new imperative gives us a bodily sensation of the moral addendum. Bodily, because it is now the practical abhorrence of the unbearable physical agony to which individuals are exposed, even with individuality about to vanish, as a form of mental reflection. It is in the unvarnished materialistic motive only that morality survives. The course of history forces materialism upon metaphysics, traditionally the direct antithesis of materialism. What the mind once boasted of defining or construing as its like motive moves in the direction of what is unlike the mind, in the direction of that which eludes the rule of the mind and yet manifests that rule as absolute evil. The somatic, unmeaningful stratum of life is the stage of the suffering which in the camps, without any consolation, burned every soothing feature out of the mind, and out of culture, the mind's objectification. The point of no return has been reached in the process which irresistibly forced metaphysics to join what it was once conceived against. Not since the youthful Hegel has philosophy, unless selling out for authorized cerebration, been able to repress how very much it slipped into material questions of existence. Children sense some of this in the fascination that issues from the flayer's zone, from carcasses, from the repulsive sweet odor of putrefaction, and from the opprobrious terms used for that zone. The unconscious power of that realm may be as great as that of infantile sexuality. The two intermingle in the anal fixation, but they are scarcely the same. As unconscious knowledge whispers to the child what is repressed by civilized education, this is what matters, says the worshipping voice. And the wretched physical existence strikes a spark in the supreme interest that is scarcely less repressed. It kindles a, quote, what is that, end quote, and, quote, where is it going, end quote. The man who managed to recall what used to strike him in the words, quote, dunghill, and, quote, pigsty, might be closer to absolute knowledge than Hegel's chapter, in which readers are promised such knowledge only to have it withheld with a superior mien. The integration of physical death into culture should be rescinded in theory, not, however, for the sake of an ontologically pure being named death, capital D death, but for the sake of that which the stench of cadavers expresses, and we are fooled about by their transfiguration into, quote, remains. A child fond of an innkeeper named Adam watched him club the rats pouring out of holes in the courtyard. It was in his image that the child made its own image of the first man. That this has been forgotten, that we no longer know what we used to feel before the dog catcher's van, is both the triumph of culture and its failure. Culture, which keeps emulating the old Adam, cannot bear to be reminded of that zone, and precisely this is not to be reconciled with the conception that culture has of itself. It abhors stench because it stinks, because, as Brecht put it in a magnificent line, its mansion is built of dog shit. Years after that line was written, Auschwitz demonstrated irrefutably that culture has failed. That this could happen in the midst of the traditions of philosophy, of art, and of the enlightening sciences says more than that these traditions and their spirit lack the power to take hold of men and work a change in them. There is untruth in those fields themselves, in the autarky that is emphatically claimed for them. All post-Auschwitz culture, including its urgent critique, is garbage. In restoring itself after the things that happened without resistance in its own countryside, culture has turned entirely into the ideology it had been ever since it presumed, in opposition to material existence, to inspire that existence with the light denied it by the separation of the mind from manual labor. Whoever pleads for the maintenance of this radically culpable and shabby culture becomes its accomplice, while the man who says no to culture is directly furthering the barbarism which our culture showed itself to be. Not even silence gets us out of the circle. In silence, we simply use the state of objective truth to rationalize our subjective incapacity, once more degrading truth into a lie. When countries of the East, for all their drivel to the contrary, abolished culture or transformed it into rubbish as a mere means of control, the culture that moans about it is getting what it deserves, and what on its part, in the name of people's democratic right to their own likeness, it is zealously heading for. The only difference is that when the apparatchiks over there acclaim their administrative barbarism as culture and regard its mischief as an inalienable heritage, they convict its reality, the infrastructure of being as barbarian as the superstructure they are dismantling by taking it under their management. In the West, at least, one is allowed to say so. The theology of the crisis registered the fact it was abstractly and therefore idly rebelling against. The metaphysics has merged with culture. That metaphysics has merged with culture. That the aureole of culture, I don't know how to say that, Aureole, of culture, the principle that the mind is absolute, was the same which tirelessly violated what it was pretending to express. After Auschwitz, there is no word tinged from on high, not even a theological one that has any right, unless it underwent a transformation. The judgment passed on the ideas long before by Nietzsche was carried out on the victims, reiterating the challenge of the traditional words and the test of whether God would permit this without intervening in his wrath. A man whose admirable strength enabled him to survive Auschwitz and other camps said in an outburst against Beckett that if Beckett had been in Auschwitz, he would be writing differently, more positively, with the frontline creed of the escapee. The escapee is right in a fashion other than he thinks. Beckett and whoever else remained in control of himself would have been broken in Auschwitz and probably forced to confess that frontline creed which the escapee clothed in the words, quote, trying to give men courage, end quote, as if this were up to any structure of the mind, as if the intent to address men, to adjust to men, did not rob them of what is their due, even if they believe the contrary. That is what we have come to in metaphysics. New section, section 3, Dying Today. And this lends suggestive force to the wish for a fresh start in metaphysics, or as they call it, for radical questioning. The wish to scrape off the delusions which a culture that had failed was papering over its guilt and over truth. But yielding to the urge for an unspoiled basic stratum will make that supposed demolition even more of a conspiracy with the culture one boasts of raising. While the fascists raged against destructive cultural Bolshevism, Heidegger was making destruction respectable as a means to penetrate being. The practical test followed promptly. Metaphysical reflections that seek to get rid of their culture. Indirect elements deny the relation of their allegedly pure categories to their social substance. They disregarded society but encouraged its continuation in existing forms, in the forms which in turn block both the cognition of truth and its realization. The idol of pure original experience is no less of a hoax than that which has been culturally processed, the obsolete categorical stock of what is. The only possible escape route would be to define both by their indirectness. Culture as the lid on the trash, and nature, even where it takes itself for the bedrock of being, as the projection of the wretched cultural wish that in all change things must stay the same. Not even the experience of death suffices as the ultimate and undoubted, as a metaphysics like the one Descartes deduced once from the nugatory ego cogitans. The derivation of the death metaphysics, whether into advertisement or heroic dying, or to the triviality of purely restating the unmistakable fact that men must die, all this ideological mischief probably rests on the fact that human consciousness to this day is too weak to sustain the experience of death, perhaps even too weak for its conscious acceptance. No man who deals candidly and freely with the objects has a life sufficient to accomplish what every man's life potentially contains. Life and death cleave asunder. The reflections that give death a meaning are as helpless as the tautological ones. The more our consciousness is extricated from animality and comes to strike us as solid and lasting in its forms, the more stubbornly will it resist anything that would cause it to doubt its own eternity. Coupled with the subject's historic enthronement as a mind was the delusion of its inalienability. Early forms of property coincided with magical practices designed to banish death, and as all human relations come to be more completely determined by property, the ratio exercises death as obstinately as rights ever did. At a final stage, in despair, death itself becomes property. Its metaphysical uplifting relieves us of its experience. I don't know. Typo here. Our current death metaphysics is nothing but society's impotent solace for the fact that social change has robbed men of what was once said to make death bearable for them, of the feeling of its epic unity with a full life. In that feeling, too, the dominion of death may have been only transfigured by the weariness of the aged, of those who are tired of life and imagine it is right for them to die, because the laborious life they had had before was not living either, because it left them not even strong enough to resist death. In the socialized society, however, in the inescapable dense web of immanence, death is felt exclusively as external and strange. Men have lost the illusion that it is commensurable with their lives. They cannot absorb the fact that they must die. Attached to this is a perverse, dislocated bit of hope that death does not constitute the entirety of existence, as it does to Heidegger. Is the very reason why a man who is not yet debilitated will experience death and its envoys, the ailments as heterogeneous and alien to the ego. The reason, one may say nimbly, is that ego is nothing but the self-preserving principle opposed to death, and that death therefore defies absorption into consciousness, which is the ego. But our experience of consciousness scarcely supports this view. In the face of death, consciousness does not necessarily take the form of defiance, as one would expect. Hardly any subject bears out Hegel's doctrine that whatever will perish of itself. Even to the aging who perceive the signs of their debility, the fact that they must die seems rather like an accident caused by their own physicists. Their own physics, with traits of the same contingency as that of the external accidents typical nowadays. This strengthens a speculation in counterpoint to the insight of the object supremacy. Whether the mind is not an element of independence, an unmixed element liberated at the very times when the mind is not devouring everything and by itself reproducing the doom of death. Despite the deceptive concern with self-preservation, it would hardly be possible without that mental element to explain the resistant strength of the idea of immortality, as Kant still harbored it. Of course, those powers of resistance seem to wane in the history of the species as they do in decrepit individuals. After the decline, long ratified in secret, of the objective religions that had pledged to rid it of its sting, death is now rendered completely and utterly alien by the socially determined decline of continuous experience as such. As the subjects live less, death grows more precipitous, more terrifying. The fact that it literally turns them into things makes them aware of reification, their permanent death in the form of their relations that is partly their fault. The integration of death in civilization, a process without power over death and a ridiculous cosmetic procedure in the face of death, is the shaping of a reaction to this social phenomenon, a clumsy attempt at the barter society to stop up the last holes left open by the world of merchandise. Death in history, particularly the collective history of the individual category, form a constellation. Once upon a time, the individual, Hamlet, inferred his absolute essentiality from the dawning awareness of the irrevocability of death. Now the downfall of the individual brings the entire construction of bourgeois existence down with it. What is described as a non-entity, in itself and perhaps even for itself. Hence the constant panic in view of death, a panic not to be quelled any more except by repressing the thought of death. Death as such, or as a primal biological phenomenon, is not to be extracted from the convolutions of history. For that, the individual as the carrier of the experience of death is far too much of a historical category. The statement that death is always the same is as abstract as it is untrue. The manner of people's coming to terms with death varies all the way into their physical side, along with the concrete conditions of their dying. In the camps, death has a novel horror, since Auschwitz, fearing death means fearing worse than death. What death does to the socially condemned can be anticipated biologically on old people we love, not only their bodies but their egos. All the things that justify their definition as human crumble without illness, without violence from outside. The remnant of confidence in their transcendent duration vanishes during their life on earth. So to speak, what should be the part of them that is not dying? The comfort of faith that even in such disintegration or in madness, the core of men continues to exist, sounds foolish and cynical in its indifference to such experiences. It extends into infinity, a pearl of pompous Philistine wisdom. Quote, "One always remains what he is," end quote. The man who turns his back on the negation of a possible fulfillment of his metaphysical need is sneering at that need. Even so, it is impossible to think of death as the last thing pure and simple. Attempts to express death in language are futile, all the way into logic, for who should be the subject of which we predicate that it is dead, here and now? Lust, which wants eternity, according to a luminous word of Nietzsche's, is not the only one to balk at passing. If death were the absolute which philosophy tried in vain to conjure positively, everything is nothing, all that we think too is thought into the void, none of it is truly thinkable. For it is a feature of truth that it will last, along with its temporal core. Without any duration at all there would be no truth, and the last trace of it would be engulfed in death, the absolute. The idea of absolute death is hardly less unthinkable than that of immortality. But for all its being unthinkable, the thought of death is not proof against the unreliability of any kind of metaphysical experience. The web of semblance in which men are caught extends to their imagined ways of tearing the veil. Kant's epistemological question, quote, "How is metaphysics possible?" end quote, yields to a question from the philosophy of history, quote, "Is it still possible to have a metaphysical experience?" end quote. That experience was never located far beyond the temporal as the academic use of the word metaphysics suggests. It has been observed that mysticism, whose very name expresses the hope that institutionalization may save the immediacy of metaphysical experience from being lost altogether, establishes social traditions and comes from tradition, across the lines of demarcation drawn by religions that regard each other as heretical. Kabbalah, The name of the body of Jewish mysticism means tradition. In its farthest ventures, metaphysical immediacy did not deny how much of it was not immediate. If it cites tradition, however, it must also admit its dependence upon the historic state of mind. Kant's metaphysical ideas were removed from the existential judgments of an experience that required material for its fulfillment. Yet the place he assigned to them, despite the antinomies, was in consistence with pure reason. Today those ideas would be as absurd as the idea expressing their absence are said to be, in a deliberately defensive classification. But if I will not deny that the philosophy of history has overthrown the metaphysical ideas, and yet I cannot bear that overthrow unless I am to deny my own consciousness as well, then a confusion that goes beyond mere semantics tends straightway to promote the fate of metaphysical ideas to a metaphysical rank of its own. The secret paralogism is that despair of the world, a despair that is true, based on facts and neither aesthetic Weltschmerz nor a wrong, reprehensible consciousness, guarantees to us that the hopelessly missed things exist, though existence at large has become a universal guilt context. Of all the disgrace deservedly reaped by theology, the worst is the positive religion's howl of rejoicing at the unbeliever's despair. They have gradually come to intone their Te Deum or Te Deum. I don't know. It's capital T-E, space, capital D-E-U-M, wherever God is denied, because at least his name is mentioned, as the means usurp the end in the ideology swallowed by all populations on earth. So in the metaphysics that has risen nowadays, does the need usurp that which is lacking? The truth content of the deficiency becomes a matter of indifference. People assert it as being good for people. The advocates of metaphysics argue in unison with the pragmatism they hold in contempt, with the pragmatism that dissolves metaphysics a priori. Likewise, despair is the final ideology, historically and socially as conditional as the course of cognition that has been gnawing at the metaphysical ideas and cannot be stopped by a cui bono. C-U-I space B-O-N-O. New section. Section 4. Happiness and idle waiting. What is a metaphysical experience? If we disdain projecting it upon allegedly primal religious experiences, we are most likely to visualize it as Proust did, in the happiness, for instance, that is promised by village names like Appleboxville, Wind Gap, or Lord's Valley. One thinks that going there would bring the fulfillment, as if there were such a thing. Being really there makes the promise recede like a rainbow, and yet one is not disappointed. The feeling now is one of being too close, rather, and not seeing it for that reason. And the difference between the landscapes and regions that determine the imagery of a childhood is presumably not great at all. What Proust saw in Illiers, I-L-L-I-E-R-S, must have happened elsewhere to many children of the same social stratum. But what it takes to form this universal, this authentic part of Proust's presentation, is to be entranced in one place without squinting at the universal. To the child it is self-evident that what delights him in his favorite village is found only there alone and nowhere else. He is mistaken, but his mistake creates the model of experience, of a concept that will end up as the concept of the thing itself, not as a pure projection from things. The wedding where Proust's narrator as a child gets his first look at the Duchess de Guermantes may have occurred just that way, with the same power over his later life, at a different place and time. Only in the face of absolute, indissoluble individuation can we hope that this, exactly this, has existed and is going to exist. Fulfilling this hope alone would fulfill the concept of the concept. But the concept clings to the promised happiness, while the world that denies us our happiness is the world of the reigning universal, the world stubbornly opposed by Proust's reconstruction of experience. Happiness, the only part of metaphysical experience that is more than impotent longing, gives us the insight of objects as something removed from the objects. Yet the man who enjoys this kind of experience naively, as though putting his hands on what the experience suggests, is acceded to the terms of the empirical world, terms he wants to transcend, though they alone give him the chance of transcending. The concept of metaphysical experience is antinomical, not only as taught by Kantian transcendental dialectics, but in other ways. A metaphysics proclaimed without recourse to subjective experience, without the immediate presence of the subject, is helpless before the autonomous subject's refusal to have imposed upon it what it cannot understand. And yet whatever is directly evident to the subject suffers of fallibility and relativity. The category of reification, which was inspired by the wishful image of unbroken subjective immediacy, no longer merits the key position accorded to it, overzealously by an apologetic thinking, happy to absorb materialist thinking. This acts back upon whatever goes under the concept of metaphysical experience. From the young Hegel on, philosophers have been attacking objective theological categories as reifications, and these categories are by no means mere residues which dialectics eliminate. They are complementary to the weakness of idealistic dialectics, of an identitarian thought that lays claim to what lies outside thought, although there is no possible definition of something contrasted with thought as its mere otherness. Deposited in the objectivity of the metaphysical categories was not congealed society alone, as the existentialists would have it. That objectivity was also a deposit of the object's supremacy as a moment of dialectics. The total liquefaction of everything thing-like regressed to the subjectivism of the pure act. It hypostatized the indirect as direct. Pure immediacy and fetishism are equally untrue. In our insistence on immediacy against reification, we are, as perceived in Hegel's institutionalism, relinquishing the element of otherness in dialectics, as arbitrary a procedure as the later Hegel's unfeasible practice to arrest dialectics in something solid beyond it. Yet the surplus over the subject, which is a subjective metaphysical experience, will not be talked of, and the element of truth and reality. These two extremes touch in the idea of truth. For there could no more be truth without a subject freeing itself from delusions than there could be truth without that which is not the subject, that in which truth has its archetype. Pure metaphysical experience grows unmistakably paler and more desultory in the course of the secularization process, and that softens the substantiality of the older type. Negatively, that type holds out in the demand, quote, "Can this be all?" end quote, a demand most likely to be actualized as waiting in vain. Artists have registered it in Waltzek. Alban Berg gave the highest rank to bars that express the idle waiting as music alone can express it, and he cited the harmony of those bars in the crucial Caesuras and at the close of Lulu. Yet no such innervation, none of what Bloch called, quote, symbolic intentionality, end quote, is proof against adulteration by mere life. Idle waiting does not guarantee that what we expect. It reflects the condition measured by its denial. The less of life remains, the greater the temptation for our consciousness to take the sparse and abrupt living remnants for the phenomenal absolute. Even so, nothing could be experienced as truly alive if something that transcends life were not promised also. No straining of the concept leads beyond that. The transcendent is and it is not. We despair of what is, and our despair spreads to the transcendental ideas that used to call a halt to despair. That the finite world of infinite agony might be encompassed by a divine cosmic plan must impress anyone not engaged in the world's business as the kind of madness that goes so well with positive normalcy. The theological conception of the paradox, that last starved-out bastion, is past rescuing, a fact ratified by the course of the world in which the scandalon that caught Kierkegaard's eye is translated into outright blasphemy. New section, section 5, quote, nihilism. The metaphysical categories live on secularized in what the vulgar drive to higher things calls the question of the meaning of life. The word has a ring of Weltanschauung which condemns the question. All but inevitably it will fetch the answer that life makes whatever sense the questioner gives it. Not even a Marxism debased to an official creed will say much else, as witnessed the late Lukács. But the answer is false. The concept of sense involves an objectivity beyond, quote, the concept of sense involves an objectivity beyond all, quote, making, end quote. A sense that is, quote, made, end quote, is already fictitious. It duplicates the subject, however collective, and defrauds it of what it seemingly granted. Metaphysics deals with an objectivity without being free to dispense with the subjective reflection. The subjects are embedded in themselves, in their, quote, constitution, end quote. What metaphysics has to ponder is the extent to which they are nonetheless able to see beyond themselves. Philosophemes that relieve themselves of this task are disqualified as counsel. The activity of someone linked with the sphere was characterized decades ago. Quote, he travels around giving lectures on meaning to employees, end quote. People who sigh with relief when life shows some similarity to life, for once, when it is not, as Karl Kraus put it, kept going only for production's and consumption's sake, will eagerly and directly take this for a sign of a transcendent presence. The deprivation of speculative idealism into the question of meaning retroactively condemns that idealism which even at its peak proclaims such a meaning, though in somewhat different words, which proclaim the mind as the absolute that cannot get rid of its origin in the inadequate subject and that satisfies its need in its own image. It is a primal phenomenon of ideology. The very totality of the question exerts a spell that comes to naught before real adversity. All affirmative poses, notwithstanding. When a desperate man who wants to kill himself asks one who tries to talk him out of it about the point of living, the helpless helper will be at a loss to name one. His every attempt can be refuted as the echo of a general consensus, the core of which appeared in the old adage that the emperor needs soldiers. A life that had any point would not need to inquire about it. the question puts the point to flight, but the opposite, abstract nihilism, would be silenced by the counter-question, quote, and what are you living for, unquote? To go after the whole, to calculate the net profit of life. This is death, which the so-called question of meaning seeks to evade, even if the lack of another way out makes it enthuse about the meaning of death. What might not have to be ashamed of the name of meaning lies in candor, not in self-seclusion. As a positive statement, the thesis that life is senseless would be as foolish as it is false to avow the contrary. The thesis is true only as a blow at the high-flown avowal. Nor is Schopenhauer's inclination to identify the essence of the world, the blind will, as absolutely negative from a humane viewpoint any longer fitting. The claim of total subsumption is far too analogous to the positive claim of Schopenhauer's despised contemporaries, the idealists. What flickers up here again is the nature religion, the fear of demons, which the Enlightenment of Epicurus once opposed by depicting the wretched idea of disinterested divine spectators as something better. Compared with Schopenhauer's irrationalism, the monotheism he attacked in a spirit of enlightenment has some truth to it also. Schopenhauer's metaphysics regresses to a phase before the awakening of genius amidst the mute world. He denies the motive of freedom, the motive men remember for the time being, and even perhaps in the phase of total unfreedom. Schopenhauer gets to the bottom of the delusiveness of individuation, but his recipe for freedom in Book 4, to deny the will to live, is no less delusive, as if the ephemerally individualized could have the slightest power over its negative absolute. The will is a thing in itself, as if it could escape from the spell of that will without either deceiving itself or allowing the whole metaphysics of the will to get away through the gap. The total determinism is no less mythical than are the totalities of Hegel's logic. Schopenhauer was an idealist, malgré lui-même, a spokesman of the spell. The totem is the totem. Like the totem, T-O-T-U-M, is the totem, T-O-T-E-M. Greatness could not fill us with despair if our minds did not harbor the concept of different colors, scattered traces of which are not absent from the negative. Whole. The trace always comes from the past, and our hopes come from their counterpart, from that which was or is doomed. Such an interpretation may very well fit the last line of Benjamin's text on elective affinities, the book. Quote, for the sake of the hopeless, only are we given hope, end quote. And yet it is tempting to look for sense, not in life at large, but in the fulfilled moments, in the moments of present existence that make up its refusal to tolerate anything outside it. Incomparable power flows from Proust, the metaphysicist, because he surrendered to this temptation with the unbridled urge to happiness of no other man, with no wish to hold back his ego. Yet in the course of his novel, the incorruptible Proust confirmed that even this fullness, the instant saved by remembrance, is not it. For all his proximity to the realm of experience of Bergson, who built a theory on the conception of life as meaningful in its concretion, Proust was an heir to the French novel of disillusionment, and as such a critic of Bergsonianism. The talk of the fullness of life, a lucus a non lucendo, even where it radiates, is rendered idle by its immeasurable discrepancy with death. Since death is irrevocable, it is ideological to assert that a meaning might rise in the light of fragmentary, albeit genuine, experience. This is why one of the central points of his work, The Death of Bergotte, finds Proust helping, gropingly, to express hope for a resurrection against all the philosophy of life, yet without seeking cover from the positive religions. The idea of a fullness of life, including the one held out to mankind by the socialist conceptions, is therefore not the utopianism one mistakes it for. It is not, because that fullness is inseparable from the craving, from what the fin de siècle called, or fin de siècle, I guess is how you say it, called, quote, living life to the full, end quote, from a desire in which violence and subjugation are inherent. If there is no hope without quenching the desire in turn is harnessed to the infamous context of like for like, and that precisely is hopeless. There is no fullness without biceps flexing. Negatively, due to the sense of non-identity, theology turns out to be right against the believers in this life on earth. That much of the jeremiads about the emptiness of life is true, but that emptiness would not be curable from within by men having a change of heart. It could only be cured by abolishing the principle of denial. With that, the cycle of fulfillment and appropriation would also vanish in the end, so very much intertwined as metaphysics and the arrangement of life. Associated with the slogans of, quote, emptiness and, quote, senselessness, end quote, is that of, quote, nihilism. Jacobi first put the term to philosophical use, and Nietzsche adopted it, presumably from newspaper accounts of terrorist acts in Russia. With an irony to which our ears have been dulled in the meantime, he used the word to denounce the opposite of what it meant in the practice of political conspirators, to denounce Christianity as the institutionalized negation of the will to live. Philosophers would not give up the word anymore. In a direction contrary to Nietzsche's, they've refunctioned it conformistically into the epitome of a condition that was accused or was accusing itself of being null and void. For thinking habits that consider nihilism bad in any case, this condition is waiting to be injected with meaning, no matter whether the critique of the meaning, the critique attributed to nihilism, is well-founded or unfounded. Though non-committal, such talk of nihilism lends itself to demagoguery, but it knocks down a straw man it put up itself. Quote, everything is nothing, end quote, is a statement as empty as the word, quote, being, with which Hegel's motion of the concept identified it, not to hold on to the identity of the two, but to replace it, advancing and then recurring again behind abstract nihility, with something definite which by its mere definition would be more than nothing. That men might want nothingness, as Nietzsche suggested on occasion, would be ridiculous hubris for each definite individual will. It would be that even if organized society managed to make the earth uninhabitable, or to blow it up, by, quote, believing in nothingness, end quote, we can mean scarcely more than by nothingness itself, by virtue of its own meaning. The, quote, something, which legitimately or not, we mean by the word, quote, believing, is not nothing. Faith in nothingness would be as insipid as would faith in being. It would be the palliative of a mind proudly content to see through the whole swindle. The indignation at nihilism that has today been turned on again is hardly aimed at mysticism, which finds the negated something even in nothingness, in the nihil privativum, and which enters into the dialectics unleashed by the word nothingness itself. The more likely point, therefore, is simply moral defamation, by mobilizing a word generally loathed and incompatible with universal good cheer of the man who refuses to accept the Western legacy of positivity and to subscribe to any meaning of things as they exist. When some prate of, quote, value nihilism, end quote, On the other hand, of there being nothing to hold on to, this cries for the, quote, overcoming, end quote, that is at home in the same subaltern language sphere. What they cock up there is the perspective whether a condition with nothing left to hold on to would not be the only condition worthy of men. The condition that would at last allow human thought to behave as autonomously as philosophy had always merely asked it to, only to prevent it in the same breath from so behaving. Acts of overcoming, even of nihilism, along with the Nietzschean type that was meant differently and yet supplied fascism with slogans, are always worse than what they overcome. The medieval nihil privativum, in which the concept of nothingness was recognized as the negation of something rather than as autosemantical, is as superior to the diligent, quote, overcomings, end quote, as the image of nirvana, of nothingness as something. People to whom despair is not a technical term may ask whether it would be better for nothing at all to be than something. Not even to this is there a general answer. For a man in a concentration camp, it would be better not to have been born, if one who escaped in time is permitted to venture any judgment about this. And yet the lighting up of an eye, indeed the feeble tail wagging of a dog, one gave a tidbit it promptly forgets, would make the ideal of nothingness evaporate. A thinking man's true answer to the question whether he is a nihilist would probably be, quote, not enough, end quote. Out of callousness, perhaps, nothing of sufficient sympathy with anything that suffers. Nothingness is the acme of abstraction, and the abstract is the abominable. The abominable. Beckett has given us the only fitting reaction to the situation of the concentration camps, a situation he never calls by name, as if it were subject to an image ban. What is, he says, is like a concentration camp. At one time he speaks of a lifelong death penalty. The only dawning hope is that there will be nothing any more. This too Beckett rejects. From the fissure of inconsistency that comes about in this fashion, the image world of nothingness as something emerges to stabilize his poetry. The legacy of action is a carrying on, which seems stoical but is full of inaudible cries that things should be different. Such nihilism implies the contrary of identification with nothingness. To Beckett, as to the Gnostics, the great world is radically evil. The created world is radically evil, and its negation is the chance of another world that is not yet. As long as the world is as it is, all pictures of reconciliation, peace, and quiet resemble the picture of death. The slightest difference between nothingness and coming to rest would be the haven of hope, the no man's land between the border posts of being and nothingness. Rather than overcome that zone, consciousness would have to extricate from it what is not in the power of the alternative. The true nihilists are the ones who oppose nihilism with their more and more faded positivities, the ones who are thus conspiring with all extant malice, and eventually with the destructive principle itself. Thought honors itself by defending what is damned as nihilism. New section, Kant's resignation. The antinomical structure of the Kantian system expressed more than contradictions, in which speculation on metaphysical objects necessarily entangles itself. It expressed something from the philosophy of history. The powerful effect which the book, Critique of Pure Reason, exerted far beyond its epistemological substance must be laid to the faithfulness with which it registered the state of the experience of consciousness. Historiographers of philosophy see the achievement of the work primarily in the succinct separation of valid cognition and metaphysics. In fact, it first appears as a theory of scientific judgments, nothing more. Epistemology and logic in the broader sense of the word are concerned with exploring the empirical world under laws. Kant, however, does intend more. Through the medium of epistemological reflection, he answers the so-called metaphysical questions in a far from metaphysically neutral way. They really must not be asked, he tells us. In that sense, the book, Critique of Pure Reason, anticipates both the Hegelian doctrine that logic and metaphysics are the same, and the positivistic doctrine in which the questions everything depends upon are dodged by abolishing them and decided by indirect negation. German idealism extrapolated its, quote, metaphysics from epistemology's fundamental claim to be the carrier of the whole. If we think it through to the end, it is precisely by its denial of objectively valid cognition of the absolute that the critique of reason makes an absolute judgment. This is what idealism stressed. Still, its consistency bends the motif into its opposite and into its untruth. The thesis imputed to Kant's objectively far more modest doctrines on the theory of science is a thesis he had reason to protest against, despite its inescapability. By means of conclusions stringently drawn from him, Kant was, against himself, expanded beyond the theory of science. By its consistency, idealism violated Kant's metaphysical reservation. A thought that is purely consistent will irresistibly turn into an absolute for itself. Kant's confession that reason cannot but entangle itself in those antinomies which he proceeds to resolve by means of reason was anti-positivistic, and yet Kant did not spurn the positivistic comfort that a man might make himself at home in the nearer domain left to reason by the critique of the faculty of reason, that he might be content to have solid ground under his feet. Kant chimes in with the eminently bourgeois affirmation of one's own confinement. Footnote, quote, a dialectical thesis of pure reason must therefore have this element to distinguish it from all sophistical tenets, that it does not concern an arbitrary question posed to a certain random purpose only, but a question that must necessarily be encountered in the course of each human reason. And secondly, that in its antithesis it does not bear with it a mere artificial delusion which, once perceived, will fade at once, but a natural and inevitable delusion, one that even when it has ceased to deceive us is still delusive, although not deceptive, and can thus be rendered harmless but never expunged, end quote. Kant. End footnote. According to Hegel's critique of Kant, letting reason judge whether it had passed the bounds of possible experience, and whether it was free to do so, presupposes already that there is a position beyond the realm separated on the Kantian map, that there is a court of last resort, so to speak. Footnote, quote, usually, great store is set by the barriers to thought, to reason, and so forth, and those barriers are said to be impassable. Behind this contention lies unawareness that by its very definition as a barrier, a thing is already passed. By a definite thing, a limit is defined as a barrier, opposed to its otherness at large, only against that which it does not bar. The otherness of a barrier is its transcending, end quote. Hegel, end footnote. As a possibility of decision, and without accounting for it, the intellectual realm was confronted by Kant's topological zeal with the very transcendence on which he banned positive judgments. German idealism came to vest this authority in the absolute subject, quote, mind, which was said to be producing the subject-object dichotomy, and thus the limit of finite cognition. Once this metaphysical view of the mind has lost its potency, however, the delimiting intention ceases to restrict anything but the cognitive subject. The critical subject turns into a resigned one, no longer trusting the infinity of its animating essence. It goes against that essence to reinforce its own finiteness, to affix itself to the finite. That subject wants to be undisturbed all the way into the metaphysical sublimation. The absolute becomes for it an idle concern. This is the repressive side of criticism. Its idealist successors were as far ahead of their class as they were in rebellion against it. Originally lurking in what Nietzsche still extolled as intellectual honesty is the self-hatred of the mind, the internalized Protestant rage at the harlot reason, a rationality that eliminates imagination. Still ranking high for the Enlightenment and for Saint-Simon, and drying up complementary on its own, such a rationality is tainted with irrationalism. A change also occurs in the function of critique. It repeats the transformation of the bourgeoisie from an evolutionary class into a conservative one. An echo of this condition is now worldwide and pervasive malice of a common sense proud of its own obtuseness. This malice argues, a contrario, for disregarding the boundary upon the cult, of which all are by now agreed. It is a, quote, positive, end quote, malice, marked by the same arbitrariness of subjective arrangement, which the common sense incarnated in Babbitt attributes to speculative thought. Kant's metaphor for the land of truth, the island in the ocean, subjectively characterizes the Robinson Crusoe style of the ivory tower, just as the dynamics of productive forces was quick enough to destroy the idyll in which the petty bourgeoisie, rightly suspicious of dynamics, would have liked to linger. The homeliness of Kant's doctrine is in crass conflict with his pathos of the infinite. If practical reason has primacy over the theoretical one, the latter, itself a mode of conduct, would have to approach the alleged capacity of its superior, if the caesura between intellect and reason is not to void reason's very concept. Yet this is precisely the direction in which Kant is pushed by his idea of scientificality. He must not say so, and yet he cannot help saying so. The discrepancy which in intellectual history is so easily put down as a relic of the older metaphysics lies in the matter itself. Kant boasts of having surveyed the isle of cognition, but its own narrow self-righteousness moves that isle into the area of untruth, which he projects on the cognition of the infinite. It is impossible to endow the cognition of finite things with a truth derived in its turn from the absolute, in Kantian terms from reason, which cognition cannot reach. At every moment, the ocean of Kant's metaphor threatens to engulf the island. New section. Section 7. Rescuing Urge and Block. That metaphysical philosophy, which historically coincides in essence with the great systems, has more glamour to it than the empiricist and positivist systems, is not just a matter of aesthetics, as the inane word, quote, conceptual poetry, unquote, would have us believe, nor is it psychological wish fulfillment. If the immanent quality of a type of thinking, the strength manifested in it, the resistance, the imagination, the unity of critique with its opposite, if all this is not an index veri, it is at least an indication. Even if it were a fact, it could not be the truth that Carnap and Mises are truer than Kant and Hegel. The Kant of the book Critique of Pure Reason said in the Doctrine of Ideas that theory without metaphysics is not possible. The fact that it is possible implies that metaphysics has its justification. The justification advanced by the same Kant whose work effectively crushed metaphysics. Kant's rescue of the intelligible sphere is not merely the Protestant apologetics known to all. It is also an attempted intervention in the dialectics of enlightenment. At the point where the dialectics terminates in the abolition of reason, that the ground of the Kantian rescuing urge lies far deeper than just in the pious wish to have, amidst nominalism and against it, some of the traditional ideas in hand. This is attested by the construction of immortality as a postulate of practical reason. The postulate condemns the intolerability of extant things and confirms the spirit of its recognition. That no reforms within the world suffice to do justice to the dead, that none of them touched upon the wrong of death. This is what moves Kantian reason to hope against reason. The secret of his philosophy is the unthinkability of despair. Constrained by the convergence of all thoughts in something absolute, he did not leave it at the absolute line between absoluteness and existence, but he was no less constrained to draw that line. He held on to the metaphysical ideas, and yet he forbade jumping from thoughts of the absolute, which might one day be realized, like eternal peace, to the conclusion that therefore the absolute exists. His philosophy, as probably every other, by the way, circles about the ontological argument for God's existence, but his own position remained open, in a grandiose ambiguity. There is the motif of, quote, muss ein ewiger Vater wohnen, must live an eternal Father, end quote, which Beethoven's composition of Schiller's Kantian Hymn to Joy accentuated in true Kantian spirit, on the word, quote, must. And there are the passages in which Kant, as close to Schopenhauer here as Schopenhauer later claimed, spurned the metaphysical ideas, particularly that of immortality, as imprisoned in our views of space and time, and thus restricted on their part. He disdained the passage to affirmation. Even according to Hegel's critique, the so-called, quote, Kantian block, end quote, the theory of the bounds of possible positive cognition, derives from the form-content dualism. Human consciousness, says the anthropological argument, is condemned, as it were, to eternal detention in the forms it happens once to have been given. What affects those forms is said to lack all definition, to need the forms of consciousness to acquire definition. But the forms are not that ultimate which Kant described. By virtue of the reciprocity between them and their existing content, they too go through an evolution. Yet this cannot be reconciled with the conception of the indestructible block. Once the forms are elements of a dynamics, as would be truly in keeping with the view of the subject as original apperception, their positive appearance can no more be stipulated for all future cognition than any one of the contents without which they do not exist, and with which they change. The dichotomy of form and content would have to be absolute to allow Kant to say that it forbids any content to be derived only from the forms, not from the matter. If the material element lies in the forms themselves, the block is shown to have been made by the very subject it inhibits. The subject is both exalted and debased if the line is drawn inside it, in its transcendental logical organization. The naive consciousness to which Goethe, too, probably tended, that we do not know yet, but that some day, perhaps, the mystery will be solved after all, comes closer to metaphysical truth than does Kant's ignoramus. His anti-idealist doctrine of the absolute barrier and the idealist doctrine of absolute knowledge are far less inimical to one another than the adherents of both thought they were. The idealist doctrine, according to the train of thought of Hegel's phenomenology, comes also to the net result that absolute knowledge is nothing but the train of thought of the book Phenomenology itself. Sorry, I should repeat that sentence, I fucked it up. His anti-idealist doctrine of the absolute barrier and the idealist doctrine of absolute knowledge are far less inimical to one another than the adherents of both thought they were. The idealist doctrine, according to the train of thought of Hegel's phenomenology, comes also to the net result that absolute knowledge is nothing but the train of thought of phenomenology itself, and thus in no way a transcending. Kant, who forbids straying into the intelligible world, equates the subjective side of Newtonian science with cognition, and its objective side with truth. The question how metaphysics is possible as a science must be taken precisely. Whether metaphysics satisfies the criteria of a cognition that takes its bearings from the ideal of mathematics and so-called classical physics. Mindful of his assumption that metaphysics is a natural disposition, Kant poses the problem with reference to the, quote, how of generally valid and necessarily supposed cognition. But what he means is the, quote, what of that cognition, its possibility itself. He denies the possibility measured by that scientific ideal. Yet science, whose imposing results make him relieve it of further misgivings, is a product of bourgeois society. The rigidly dualistic basic structure of Kant's model for criticizing reason duplicates the structure of a production process where the merchandise drops out of the machines as his phenomena drop out of the cognitive mechanism, and where the material and its own definition are matters of indifference vis-a-vis the profit, much as appearance is a matter of indifference to Kant, who had it stenciled. The final product with its exchange value is like the Kantian objects, which are made subjectively and are accepted as objectivities. The permanent reductio ad hominem of all appearance prepares cognition for purposes of internal and external dominance. Its supreme expression is the principle of unity, a principle borrowed from production which has been split into partial acts. The moment of dominance in Kant's theory of reason is The moment of dominance in Kant's theory of reason is that it really concerns itself only with the domain in which scientific theses hold sway. Kant's confinement of his questioning to empirically organized natural science, his orientation of it by validity, and his subjectivist critique of knowledge are so entwined that none could be without the others. As long as the subjective inquiry is to be a testing of validities, cognitions which have no scientific sanction, in other words, which are not necessary and not universal, are second-rate. This is why all efforts to emancipate Kantian epistemology from the realm of natural science had to fail. We cannot supplement and make up within the identifying rudiment what that rudiment eliminates by nature. The most we can do is change the rudiment because we recognize the rudiment's insufficiency. The fact, however, that the rudiment does so little justice to the living experience which cognition is, this fact indicates that the rudiment is false, and that it is incapable of doing what it sets out to do, namely to provide a basis for experience. For such a rigid and invariant basis contradicts that which experience tells us about itself, about the change that occurs constantly in the form of experience, the more open it is, and the more it is actualized. To be incapable of this change is to be incapable of experience. To Kant we can add no theorems of knowledge that were not developed by him, because their exclusion is central to his epistemology. The systematic claim of the doctrine of pure reason makes this exclusion unmistakable enough. The Kantian system is a system of stop signals. The subjectively directed constitutional analysis does not alter the world as it is given to a naive bourgeois consciousness. Rather, it takes pride in its, quote, empirical realism, end quote. But it sees the height of the validity it claims as one with the level of abstraction. Obsessed with the a priority of its synthetic judgments, it tends to expurgate any part of cognition that does not bow to their rules. The social division of labor is respected without reflection, along with the flaw that has become strikingly clear in the 200 years since, that the sciences organized by a division of labor have usurped an illegitimate monopoly on truth. But in bourgeois and very Kantian terms, the paralogism of Kant's epistemology are the bad checks that went to protest with the unfoldment of science into a mechanical activity. The authority of the Kantian concept of truth turned terroristic with the ban on thinking the absolute. Irresistibly, it drifts toward a ban on all thinking. That the Kantian block projects on truth is the self-maiming of reason, the mutilation reason inflicted upon reason's self as a rite of initiation into its own scientific character. Hence the scantiness of what happens in Kant as cognition, compared with the experience of the living, by which the idealistic system wished to do right, even though in the wrong fashion. Kant would hardly have denied that the idea of truth mocks the scientific ideal, but the discrepancy is by no means revealed only in view of the mundus intelligibilis. It's probably not sounding right. Mundus intelligibilis? I don't know. It shows in every cognition that is accomplished by a consciousness free of landing strings. Jesus Christ. But the discrepancy is by no means revealed only in view of the mundus intelligibilis. It shows in every cognition that is accomplished by a consciousness free of leading strings. In that sense, the Kantian block is a phenomenon blaspheming against the spirit in which Hölderlin's late hymns philosophically outstripped philosophy. The idealists were well aware of this, but what was manifest to them came under the same spell which forced Kant to contaminate experience and science. Though many an idealistic stirring aimed at openness, the idealists would pursue it by extending the Kantian principle, and the contents grew even more unfree to them than to Kant, and this in turn invests the Kantian block with its moment of truth. It forestalled a mythology of the concept. Socially, there is good reason to suspect that block, the bar erected against the absolute of being one with the necessity to labor, which in reality keeps mankind under the same spell that Kant transfigured into a philosophy. The imprisonment in immanence to which he honestly and brutally condemns the mind is the imprisonment in self-preservation as it is imposed on men by a society that conserves nothing but the denial that would not be necessary anymore. Once the natural historic cares we share with beetles were broken through, a change would occur in the attitude which human consciousness takes toward truth. Its present attitude is dictated by the objectivity that keeps men in the state they are in. Even if Kant's doctrine of the block was part of a social delusion, it is still based solidly as the factual rule of the delusion. The separation of the sensual and intellectual realms, the nerve of the argument in favor of the block, is a social product. By the turismos, sensuality is designated as a victim of the intellect because, all arrangements to the contrary notwithstanding, the state of the world fails to content sensuality. The social qualifications of the sensual realm might well permit the split to disappear one day, whereas the idealists or ideologues, either glorifying the reconciliation of the unreconciled as accomplished or attributing it to the unreconciled totality. The idealistic efforts to explicate the mind as its own union with that which is not identical with it were as consistent as they were futile. Such self-reflection happens even to the thesis of the primacy of practical reason, a thesis which from Kant via the idealist leads straight to Marx. Moreover, the dialectics of practice call for the abolition of practice, of production for production's sake, of the universal cover for the wrong practice. This is the materialistic ground of the traits which in negative dialectics rebel against the official doctrinal concept of materialism. The elements of independence and irreducibility in the mind may well accord with the supremacy of the object. As soon as the mind calls its chains by name, the chains it gets into by chaining others, it grows independent here and now. It begins to anticipate, and what it anticipates is freedom, not entangled practice. The idealist made a heaven of the mind, but woe betide the man who had a mind. New section, section 8. Mundus intelligibilis. It's probably intelligibilis. I don't fucking know. Give me a break. Come on, guys. Kant confronts the construction of his block with the positive construction of metaphysics in Critique of Practical Reason. Kant did not pass in silence over its moment of despair. Quote, even if a transcendental faculty of freedom may serve as a supplement, perhaps to initiate changes in the world, this faculty would have to be solely outside the world at least, although it always remains an audacious presumption to assume outside the totality of possible views, of all possible views, an object that cannot be given to any possible perception. End quote. Kant. The parentheses around the quote, the parenthesis about the quote, audacious presumption, end quote, shows how skeptical Kant is of his own mundus intelligibilis. This formulation from the footnote of the antithesis of the third antinomy comes close to atheism. What is so zealously postulated later is here called theoretically presumptuous. Kant's desperate reluctance to imagine the postulate as an existential judgment is strenuously evaded. According to the passage, it would have to be possible to conceive as an object of possible visuality, at least, what must at the same time be conceived as removed from all visuality. Reason would have to capitulate to the contradiction, unless the hubris of prescribing its own bounds had first irrationalistically narrowed reason's domain without tying it to those bounds objectively, as reason. But if, as by the idealists and also by the Neo-Kantians, visuality too were included in infinite reason, transcendence would be virtually cashiered by the immanence of the mind. What Kant alludes to with respect to freedom would apply to God and immortality as well, only more so. For those do not refer to any pure possibility of conduct. Their own concepts make them postulates of things in being, no matter of what kind. These entities need a, quote, matter, and in Kant's case they could depend entirely upon the visuality, whose possibility he excludes from the transcendent ideas. The pathos of Kantian intelligibility complements the difficulty of ascertaining it in any way, and if it were only in the medium of the self-sufficient thought designated by the word in, quote, intelligible, unquote, the word must not refer to anything real. But the motion of Kant's book, Critique of Practical Reason, proceeds to a positive mundus intelligibilis that could be envisioned in Kant's intention. What ought to be emphatically distinguished from what is can no sooner be established as a realm of its own and equipped with absolute authority than the procedure will, albeit involuntarily, make it assume the character of a second existence, a thought in which we do not think something is not a thought. The ideas, the substance of metaphysics, are not visual, but neither could they be, quote, airy nothings, end quote, of thought, lest they be stripped of all objectivity. The intelligible would be devoured by the very subject which the intelligible sphere was to transcend. A century after Kant, such flattening of the intelligible into the imaginary came to be the cardinal sin of the neo-romanticists, of the fin de siècle, of the phenomenological philosophy tailor-made to their measure. The concept of the intelligible is not one of a reality, nor is it a concept of something imaginary. It is aporetical rather. Nothing on earth and nothing in the empty heavens is to be saved by defending it. The quote, yes, but, end quote, answer to the critical argument, the refusal to have anything wrested away, these are already forms of obstinate insistence on existence, forms of a clutching that cannot be reconciled with the idea of rescue, in which the spasm of such prolonged self-preservation would be eased. Nothing can be saved unchanged. Nothing that is not passed through the portal of its death. If rescue is the inmost impulse of any man's spirit, there is no hope but unreserved surrender of that which is to be rescued as well as the hopeful spirit. The posture of hope is to hold lightly what the subject will hold on to, what the subject expects to endure. The intelligible in the spirit of Kantian delimitation, no less than in that of the Hegelian method, would be to transcend the limits drawn by both of these, to think in negations alone. Paradoxically, the intelligible sphere which Kant envisioned would once again be, quote, appearance, end quote. It would be that which is hidden from the finite mind shows to that mind, that the mind is forced to think, and due to its own finiteness, to disfigure. The concept of the intelligible is the self-negation of the finite mind. In the mind, mere entity becomes aware of its deficiency. The departure from an existence obdurate in itself is the source of what separates the mind from its nature-controlling principle. The point of this turn is that the mind should not become existent in its own eyes either, to avoid an endless repetition of the ever-same. The side of the mind that is hostile to life would be sheer depravity if it did not climax in its self-reflection. The asceticism which the mind demands of others is wrong, but its own asceticism is good. In its self-negation, the mind transcends the mind's self, a step not so alien to Kant's subsequent book, Metaphysics of Morals, as might be expected. To be a mind at all, it must know that what it touches upon does not exhaust it, that the finiteness that it is, Jesus Christ, let me restart the sentence. To be a mind at all, it must know what it touches upon does not exhaust it, that the finiteness that is its like does not exhaust it. The mind thinks what would be beyond it. Such metaphysical experience is the inspiration of Kantian philosophy. Once that philosophy is drawn out of the armor of its method, the question whether metaphysics is still possible at all must reflect the negation of the finite which finiteness requires. Its enigma animates the word, quote, intelligible. The conception of that word is not wholly unmotivated, thanks to that independent moment which the mind lost by being absolutized, and which, as not identical with entity, it obtains as soon as we insist upon non-identity, as soon as all there is does not evaporate in things of the mind. The mind, for all its indirectness, shares in existence, the substitute for its alleged transcendental purity. Although its moment of transcendent objectivity cannot be split off and ontologized, that moment is the unobtrusive sight of metaphysical possibility. The concept of the intelligible realm would be the concept of something which is not, and yet is not a pure non-being. Under the rules of the sphere whose negation is the intelligible sphere, the intelligible one would have to be rejected without resistance, as imaginary. Nowhere else is truth so fragile. It may deteriorate into the hypostasis of something thought up for no reason, something in which thought means to possess what it has lost, and then again the effort to comprehend it is easy to confuse with things that are. If in our thinking we mistake thoughts for realities, in the paralogism of the ontological argument for the existence of God, which Kant demolished, our thinking is void, but the fallacy is the direct elevation of negativity, the critique of what merely is, into positivity, as if the insufficiency of what is might guarantee that what is will be rid of that insufficiency. Even in extremis, a negated negative is not a positive. Kant called transcendental dialectics a logic of semblance, the doctrine of the contradictions in which any treatment of transcendent things as positively knowable is bound to become entangled. His verdict is not made obsolete by Hegel's effort to vindicate the logic of semblance as a logic of truth. But reflection is not cut short by the verdict on semblance. Once made conscious, the semblance is no longer the same. What finite beings say about transcendence is the semblance of transcendence. But as Kant well knew, it is a necessary semblance. Hence the incomparable metaphysical relevance of the rescue of semblance, the object of aesthetics. New section. Section 9. Neutralization. In Anglo-Saxon countries, Kant is often euphemistically called an agonist. An agnostic, Jesus Christ. In Anglo-Saxon countries, Kant is often euphemistically called an agnostic. However little this leaves of the wealth of his philosophy, the awful oversimplification is not barefaced nonsense. The antinomical structure of the Kantian doctrine survives the resolution of the antinomies, and it can be crudely translated into a directive to thought, to refrain from idle questions. It is above the vulgar form of bourgeois skepticism, whose solidity is serious only about what one has safely in hand, though Kant was not utterly free of such states of mind either. His authority in Germany was surely strengthened far beyond the effect of his thoughts by the fact that in the categorical imperative, and indeed in the ideas of critique of pure reason, that disdained sublimity was added with raised forefinger as a bonus with which the bourgeoisie is as loath to dispense as with its Sunday, that parody of freedom from toil. The element of non-committal conciliatoriness in rigorism went rather well with the decorative tendency to neutralize all things of the mind. After the triumph of the revolution, or where there was no revolution, after the imperceptible advance of general, quote, bourgeoisization, end quote, that tendency conquered the entire scenery of the mind, along with the theorems previously used as weapons of bourgeois emancipation. No longer needed by the interest of the victorious class, those theorems became uninteresting in a twofold sense. As Spengler astutely noted in Rousseau's case, society, for all its ideological praise of the spirit, subordinates the function of the spirit. The Kantian non-liqueur contributed to transforming the critique of feudalism's ally, religion, into that indifference which donned the mantle of humanity under the name of tolerance. The spirit, in the form of metaphysics no less than in the form of art, grows only more neutralized as the culture of which society prided itself loses its relation to any possible practice. In Kant's metaphysical ideas, that relation was still unmistakable. In those ideas, bourgeois society sought to transcend bourgeois society's own limited principle, to void itself, as it were. Such a spirit becomes unacceptable, and the culture turns into a compromise between its form of bourgeois utility and the side of it which in Neo-German nomenclature is, quote, undesirable, and projected into an unattainable distance. Material circumstances add their part. Capital, compelled to expand its investments, possesses itself of the spirit, whose own inevitable objectifications spur it to transform them into property, into merchandise. Aesthetics, by its disinterested approbation of the spirit, transfigures and debases it at the same time. Satisfied to observe, to admire, and finally blindly and unrelatedly to revere all those things that were created and thought once upon a time, irrespective of their truth content. Objectively, it is a mockery how the increasing merchandise character of culture aestheticizes it for utility's sake. Philosophy becomes the manifestation of the spirit as a showpiece. What Bernhard Gruithuisen traced back to the 18th and 17th centuries in religion, that the devil is no longer to be feared and God no longer to be hoped for, this expands beyond metaphysics, in which the memories of God and the devil live on even where it is a critical reflection on that fear and hope. What in a highly unideological sense ought to be the most urgent concern of men has vanished. Objectively, it has become problematical. Subjectively, the social network and the permanently overtaxing pressure to adjust leaves men neither the time nor the strength to think about it. The questions are not solved, and not even their insolubility is proven. They are forgotten, and any talk of them lulls them so much more deeply to their evil sleep. Goethe's fatal dictum, that Eckermann need not read Kant because Kant's philosophy had done its job and entered into the universal consciousness, this line has triumphed in the socialization of metaphysical indifference. The indifference of consciousness to metaphysical questions, questions that have by no means been laid to rest by satisfaction in this world, is hardly a matter of indifference to metaphysics itself, however. Hidden in it is a horror that would take men's breath away if they did not repress it. We might be tempted to speculate anthropologically whether the turn in evolutionary history that gave the human species its open consciousness, and thus an awareness of death, whether this turn does not contradict a continuing animal constitution which prohibits men to bear that consciousness. The price to be paid for the possibility to go on living would be a restriction of consciousness, then a means to shield it from that consciousness is, Jesus Christ. The price to be paid for the possibility to go on living would be a restriction of consciousness, then, a means to shield it from what consciousness is, after all, the consciousness of death. It is a hopeless perspective that biologically, so to speak, the obtuseness of all ideologues might be due to a necessity of self-preservation, and that the right arrangement of society would by no means have to make it disappear. Although, of course, it is only in the right society that chances for the right life will arise. The present society still tells us lies about death not having to be feared, and it sabotages any reflection upon it. Schopenhauer, the pessimist, was struck by the fact how little men in media vita are apt to bother with death. Footnote, quote, man alone bears the certainty of his death with him in abstract concepts, and yet, a fact that is very strange, this certainty can frighten him only at specific moments when an occasion recalls it to his imagination. Reflection can do little against nature's powerful voice, the permanent condition holding sway in man, as the unthinking animal, is an assurance sprung from the innermost feeling that he is nature, the world itself due to this assurance. No man is notably troubled by the thought of certain and never distant death, but each one lives as if he had to live forever, which goes so far that we might say, no one really has a living conviction of the certainty of his death, else no man's mood could differ so greatly from a condemned criminal's. We might say, rather, that everyone admits that certainty in abstracto and theoretically, but puts it aside like all other theoretical truths that do not apply in practice, without the slightest acceptance of it into his living consciousness. End quote. Schopenhauer, The World as Will and Idea. End footnote. Like Heidegger 100 years later, Schopenhauer read the indifference in human nature rather than in men as products of history. Both Heidegger and Schopenhauer came to regard the lack of metaphysical sense as a metaphysical phenomenon. In any case, it is a measure of the depth reached by neutralization and existential of the bourgeois consciousness. This depth makes us doubt whether, as has been drilled into the mind by a romantic tradition that survived all romanticism, things were so very different in times allegedly steeped in metaphysics, in the times which the young Lukács called, quote, replete with meaning, end quote. The tradition carried a paralogism with it. The truth of metaphysical views is not assured by their collective obligatoriness, by the power they exert over life in closed cultures. Rather, the possibility of metaphysical experience is akin to the possibility of freedom, and it takes an unfolded subject, one that has torn the bonds advertised as salutary, to be capable of freedom. The dull captive of socially authorized views on allegedly blessed times, on the other hand, is related to the positivistic believer in facts. The ego must have been historically strengthened if, beyond the immediacy of the reality principle, it is to conceive the idea of what is more than entity. An order that shuts itself up in its own meaning will shut itself away from the possibility above order. Vis-a-vis theology, metaphysics is not just a historically later stage, as it is according to positivistic doctrine. It is not only theology secularized into a concept. It preserves theology in its critique by uncovering the possibility of theology, of what theology may force upon men and thus desecrate. The cosmos of the spirit was exploded by the forces it had bound. It received its just deserts. The autonomous Beethoven is more metaphysical, and therefore more true, than Bach's Ordo. Subjectively liberated experience and metaphysical experience converge in humanity. Even in an age when they fall silent, great works of art express hope more powerfully than the traditional theological texts, and any such expression is configurative with that of the human side, nowhere as unequivocally as in moments of Beethoven. Signs that not everything is futile come from sympathy with the human, from the self-reflection of the subject's natural side. It is only in experiencing its own naturalness that genius soars above nature. What remains venerable about Kant is that in his theory of the intelligible, he registered the constellation of the human and the transcendent as no philosopher beside him. Before humanity opens its eyes, the objective pressure of the miseries of life are made. Men exhaust themselves in their neighbor's shame, and the immanence of meaning in life is the cover of their imprisonment. Ever since there appeared something like organized society, a solidly built autarkic context, the urge to leave it has been weakened. A child who has not been prepared already could not help noticing in his Protestant hymn book how poor and tenuous the part entitled, quote, "The Last Things," end quote, is in comparison with all the training exercises for what the faithful should believe and how they ought to behave. That magic and superstition might continue to flourish in religions, as has long been suspected, and the reverse of that suspicion is that the core, the hope for a beyond, was hardly ever so important to the positive religions as their concept required. Metaphysical speculation unites with speculation in philosophy of history, for the chance of the right consciousness, even of those last things, it will trust nothing but a future without life's miseries. The curse of these miseries is that instead of spurring us beyond mere existence, They disguise existence and confirm it as a metaphysical authority. Quote, all is vanity, end quote. The word with which immanence has been endowed by great theologians ever since Solomon. It too is too abstract to guide us beyond immanence. Where men are assumed that their existence is a matter of indifference, they are not going to lodge any protest as long as their attitude toward existence remains unchanged. The rest seems vain to them also. If one accuses entity of non-entity without differentiation, and without a perspective of possibility, he aids and abets the dull bustle. The bestiality which such total practice amounts to is worse than the original bestiality. It comes to be a principle unto itself. The Capuchin sermon of the vanity of immanence secretly liquidates transcendence as well. For transcendence feeds on nothing but the experiences we have in immanence. But neutralization, profoundly sworn to that immanence, has survived even the catastrophes which, according to the clarion calls of the apologists, were to have thrown men back upon their radical concerns. For there has been no change in society's basic condition. The theology and metaphysics which necessity resurrected are condemned, despite some valiant Protestant resistance, to serve as ideological passports for conformism. No rebellion of mere consciousness will lead beyond that. In the minds of the subjects, too, a bourgeois society will choose total destruction, its objective potential, rather than rise to reflections that would threaten its basic stratum. The metaphysical interest of men would require that their material ones be fully looked after. While their material interests are shrouded from them, they live under Maya's veil. What is must be changeable if it is not to be at all. New section. Section 10, quote, only a parable. Decades after Arnold Schoenberg set Stefan George's Rapture to music, he wrote a commentary praising the poem as a prophetic anticipation of the feelings of astronauts. In this naive reduction of one of his most important works to the level of science fiction, he was involuntarily acting out the metaphysical need. The subject matter of that neo-romanticist poem, the face of a man setting foot on another planet, is beyond doubt a parable for something internal, for an ecstasy and exaltation recalling Maximinus. The ecstasy is not one in space, not even in the space of cosmic experience, although it must take its images from that experience. But precisely this shows the objective ground of the excessively earthly interpretation. Taking literally what theology promises would be as barbarian as that interpretation. Historically accumulated respect alone prevents our consciousness from doing so, and like the symbolic language of that entire cycle, poetic exaltation has been pilfered from the theological realm. Religion a la lettre would be like science fiction. Space travel would take us to the reality promised heaven. Theologians have been unable to refrain from childishly pondering the consequences of rocket trips for their Christology, and the other way around. The infantile interest in space travel brings to light the infantilism that is latent in messages of salvation. Yet if these messages were cleansed of all subject matter, if their sublimation were complete, their disseminators would be acutely embarrassed if asked to say what the messages stand for. If every symbol symbolizes nothing but another symbol, another conceptuality, the core remains empty, and so does religion. This is the antinomy of theological consciousness today. Getting along with it would be easiest for the anachronistic primitive Christianity of Tolstoy, a successio Christi, here and now, with closed eyes and without reflection. Goethe's construction of Faust, already has a touch of the antinomy. When Faust says, quote, Die Botschaft, hör ich wohl, allein mir fehlt der Glaube. I hear the message, yet I lack the faith, end quote. The depth of the emotions that hold him back from suicide is interpreted by him as a return of deceptively consoling childhood traditions, and yet he is saved into the Marian heaven. The dramatic poem leaves unsettled whether its gradual progress refutes the skepticism of the thinking adult, or whether its last word is another symbol. Quote, nur ein Gleichnis, only a parable, end quote. And transcendence is secularized, in more or less Hegelian fashion, into a picture of the whole of fulfilled immanence. Any man who would nail down transcendence can rightly be charged, as by Karl Kraus, for instance, with lack of imagination, anti-intellectualism, and thus a betrayal of transcendence. On the other hand, if the possibility, however feeble and distant, of redemption in existence is cut off altogether, the human spirit would become an illusion, and the finite conditioned, merely existing subject would eventually be deified as carrier of the spirit. An answer to this paradox of the transcendent was Rimbaud's vision of a mankind freed from oppression as being the true deity. At a later date, the old Kantian Meinona undisguisedly mythologized the subject and made idealism manifest as hubris. With speculative conquest of this sort, science fiction and rocketry found it easy to come to an understanding. If indeed the earth belongs, if even the earth alone, among all heavenly bodies, were inhabited by rational beings, the idiocy of such a metaphysical phenomenon would amount to a denunciation of metaphysics. In the end, men would really be gods. And what gods? Only under a spell that prevents them from knowing it, and without dominion over the cosmos. Luckily, the latter fact made such speculations null and void again. All metaphysical speculations are fatally thrust into the apocryphal, however. The ideological untruth in the concept of transcendence is the separation of body and soul, a reflex of the division of labor. It leads to idolization of the res cogitans as the nature-controlling principle, and to the material denials that would founder on the concept of a transcendence beyond the context of guilt. But what hope clings to, as in Mignon's song, is the transfigured body. Metaphysics will not hear of that. It will not demean itself to material things, and this is why it passes the line to an inferior faith in spirits. Between the hypostasis of non-corporeal and yet individuated spirit, and what would theology have in hand without this? The spiritualism, the mendacious assertion that purely spiritual beings exist. The only difference is the historical dignity clothing the concept of, quote, spirit. The effect of this dignity is that power, social success, comes to be the criterion of metaphysical truth. The English language drops the German distinction between spiritismus, the German word for spiritualism, and spiritualismus. In German, the doctrine of the spirit as the individual substantial principle. The equivocation comes from the epistemological need, which once upon a time moved the idealist to go beyond the analysis of individual consciousness and to construe a transcendental or absolute one. Individual consciousness is a piece of the spatial temporal world, a piece without any prerogatives over that world, and not conceivable by human faculties as detached from the corporeal world. Yet the idealistic construction, which proposes to eliminate the earthly remains, becomes void as soon as it wholly expunges that egoity which served as the model for the concept of, quote, spirit, unquote. Hence the assumption of a non-sensory egoity, which as existence, contrary to its own definition, is nonetheless to manifest itself in space and time. According to the present state of cosmology, heaven and hell as entities in space are simple archaicisms. This would relegate immortality to one of spirits, lending it a spectral and unreal character that mocks its own concept. Christian dogmatics in which the souls were conceived as awakening simultaneously with the resurrection of the flesh was metaphysically more consistent, more enlightened, if you will, than speculative metaphysics, just as hope means a physical resurrection and feels defrauded of the best part of its spiritualization. With that, however, the impositions of metaphysical speculation wax intolerably. Cognition weighs heavily in the scale of absolute mortality, something speculation cannot bear, something that makes it a matter of absolute indifference to itself. The idea of truth is supreme among the metaphysical ideas, and this is where it takes us. It is why one who believes in God cannot believe in God, why the possibility represented by the divine name is maintained, rather by him who does not believe. Once upon a time the image ban extended to pronouncing the name. Now the ban itself has in that form come to evoke suspicion of superstition. The ban has been exacerbated. The mere thought of hope is a transgression against it, an act of working against it. Thus deeply embedded in is the history of metaphysical truth, of the truth that vainly denies history, which is progressive demythologization. Yet demythologization devours itself, as the mythical gods like to devour their children, leaving behind nothing but what merely is. Demythologization recoils into the mythos, for the mythos is nothing else than the closed system of immanence of that which is. This contradiction is what metaphysics is now coalesced into. To thinking that tries to remove the contradiction, untruth threatens here and there. New section. Semblance of otherness. In spite of, and so to speak, absorbing the Kantian critique, the ontological argument for the existence of God was resurrected in Hegelian dialectics. In vain, however. Hegel's consistent resolution of non-identity into pure identity, the concept comes to be the guarantor of the non-conceptual. Transcendence, captured by the immanence of the human spirit, is at the same time turned into the totality of the spirit and abolished altogether. Thereafter, the more transcendence crumbles under enlightenment, both in the world and in the human mind, the more arcane will it be, as though concentrating in an outermost point above all mediations. In this sense, the anti-historical theology of downright otherness has its historical index. The question of metaphysics is sharpened into the question whether this utter tenuous abstractness, indefiniteness, is the last already lost defensive position of metaphysics, or whether metaphysics survives only in the meanest and shabbiest, whether a state of commensurate insignificance will, let it restore reason to the autocratic reason that performs its office without resistance or reflection. The thesis of positivism is that even a metaphysics that has escaped to profanity is void. Even the idea of truth on whose account positivism was initiated is sacrificed. Credit is due to Wittgenstein for having pointed this out. However well his commandment of silence may otherwise go with a dogmatic falsely resurrected metaphysics that can no longer be distinguished from the wordless rapture of believers in being. What demythologization would not affect without making it apologetically available is not an argument. The sphere of arguments is antinomical, pure and simple. But the experience that if thought is not decapitated, it will flow into transcendence, down to the idea of a world that would not only abolish extant suffering, but revoke the suffering that is irrevocably past. To have all thoughts converge upon the concept of something that would differ from the unspeakable world that is, this is not the same as the infinitesimal principle whereby Leibniz and Kant meant to make the idea of transcendence commensurable with a science whose fallibility, the confusion of control of nature with being in itself, is needed to motivate the correcting experience of convergence. The world is worse than hell, and it is better. It is worse because even nihility, like nihilism, could not be that absolute as which it finally appears conciliatory in Schopenhauer's Nirvana. There is no way out of the closed context of immanence. It denies the world even the measure of sense accorded to it by the Hindu philosophy that views it as the dream of an evil demon. The mistake in Schopenhauer's thinking is that the law which keeps immanence under its own spell is directly said to be that essence which immanence blocks, the essence that would not be conceivable as other than transcendence. But the world is better than hell because the absolute conclusiveness which Schopenhauer attributes to the world's course is borrowed in turn from the idealistic system. It is a purely identity principle, and as deceptive as any identity principle. As in Kafka's writings, the disturbed and damaged course of the world is incommensurable, also with the sense of its sheer senselessness. As in Kafka's writings, the disturbed and damaged course of the world is immeasurable, also with the sense of its sheer senselessness and blindness. We cannot stringently construe it according to their principle. It resists all attempts at a desperate consciousness to posit despair as an absolute. The world's course is not absolutely conclusive, nor is absolute despair, rather, despair in its conclusiveness. However void every trace of otherness in it, however much all happiness is marred by revocability, in the breaks that belie identity, entity is still pervaded by the ever-broken pledges of that otherness. All happiness is but a fragment of the entire happiness men are denied, and are denied by themselves. Convergence, the humanly promised otherness of history, points unswervingly to what ontology illegitimately locates before history, or exempts from history. The concept is not real, as the ontological argument would have it, but there would be no conceiving it if we were not urged to conceive it by something in the matter. Karl Kraus, armored against every tangible, imaginatively unimaginative assertion of transcendence, preferred to read transcendence longingly rather than to strike it out. And he was not a romantically liberal metaphoricist. Metaphysics cannot rise again. The concept of resurrection belongs to creatures, not to something created. And in structures of the mind it is an indication of untruth, but it may originate only with the realization of what has been thought in its sign. Art anticipates some of this. Nietzsche's work is brimful of anti-metaphysical invective, but no formula describes metaphysics as faithfully as Zarathustra's, quote, pure fool, pure poet, end quote. The thinking artist understood the unthought art, a thought that does not capitulate to the wretchedly ontical, will founder upon its criteria. Truth will turn into untruth, philosophy into folly. And yet philosophy cannot abdicate if stupidity is not to triumph and realized unreason. Au sant je préfère les fous. Folly is truth in the form which men are struck with Folly is truth in the form which men are struck with, as amid untruth they will not let truth go. Art is semblance, even at its highest peaks, but its semblance, the irresistible part of it, is given to it by what is not semblance. What art, notably the art decried as nihilistic, says in refraining from judgments is that everything is not just nothing. If it were, whatever it would be pale, colorless, and indifferent. No light falls on men and things without reflecting transcendence. Indelible from the resistance of the fungible world of barter is the resistance of the eye that does not want the colors of the world to fade. Semblance is a promise of non-semblance. New section, section 12, self-reflection on dialectics. The question is whether metaphysics as a knowledge of the absolute is at all possible without the construction of an absolute knowledge, without that idealism which supplied the title for the last chapter of Hegel's Phenomenology. Is a man who deals with the absolute not necessarily claiming to be the thinking organ with the capacity to do so, and thus the absolute himself? And on the other hand, if dialectics turned into a metaphysics that is not simply like dialectics, would it not violate its own strict concept of negativity? Dialectics, the epitome of negative knowledge, will have nothing beside it. Even a negative dialectics drags along the commandment of exclusiveness from the positive one, from the system. Such reasoning would require a non-identical consciousness to be negated as finite and fallible. In all its historical forms, dialectics prohibited stepping out of it. Willy-nilly it played the part of a conceptual mediator between the unconditional spirit and the finite one. This is what intermittently kept making theology its enemy. Although dialectics allows us to think the absolute is transmitted by dialectics, remains in bondage to conditioned thinking. If Hegel's absolute was a secularization of the deity, it was still the deity's secularization, even as the totality of mind and spirit. That absolute remained chained to its finite human model. But if our thought, fully aware of what it is doing, gropes beyond itself, if in otherness it recognizes something which is downright incommensurable with it, but which it thinks anyway, then the only shelter it will find lies in the dogmatic tradition. In such thoughts, our thinking is estranged from its content, unreconciled and newly condemned to two kinds of truth, and that in turn would be incompatible with the idea of truth. Metaphysics depends upon whether we can get out of this aporia otherwise than by stealth. To this end, dialectics is obliged to make a final move, being at once the impression and the critique of the universal delusive context. It must now turn ever against itself. The critique of every self-absolutizing particular is a critique of the shadow which absoluteness casts upon the critique. It is a critique of the fact that critique itself, contrary to its own tendency, must remain within the medium of the concept. It destroys the claim of identity by testing and honoring it. Therefore, it can reach no farther than that claim. The claim is a magic circle that stamps critique with the appearance of absolute knowledge. It is up to the self-reflection of critique to extinguish that claim, to extinguish it in the very negation of negation that will not become a positing. Dialectics is the self-consciousness of the objective context of delusion. It does not mean to have escaped from that context. Its objective goal is to break out of the context from within. The strength required from the break grows in dialectics, from the context of immanence, that would apply to it once more, is Hegel's dictum that in dialectics an opponent's strength is absorbed and turned against him, not just in the dialectical particular, but eventually in the whole. By means of logic, dialectics grasps the coercive character of logic, hoping that it may yield, for that coercion itself is the mythical delusion, the compulsory identity. But the absolute, as it hovers before metaphysics, would be the non-identical that refuses to emerge within the compulsion of identity, that refuses to emerge until the compulsion of identity has dissolved. Without a thesis of identity, dialectics is not the whole, but neither will it be a cardinal sin to depart from it in a dialectical step. It lies in the definition of negative dialectics that it will not come to rest in itself as if it were total. This is its form of hope. Kant registered some of this in his doctrine of the transcendent thing in itself, beyond the mechanisms of identification. His successors, however stringently they criticized the doctrine, were reinforcing the spell, regressing like the post-revolutionary bourgeoisie as a whole. It's disgusting. But hypostatized coercion itself as the absolute. Kant, on his part, in defining the thing in itself as the intelligible thing, had indeed conceived transcendence as non-identical, but in equating it with the absolute subject, he had bound to the identity principle after all. The cognitive process that is supposed to bring us asymptomatically close to the transcendent thing is pushing that thing ahead of it, so to speak, and removing it from our consciousness. The identifications of the absolute transpose it upon man, the source of the identity principle, as they will admit now and then, and as enlightenment can strikingly point out to them every time. They are anthropomorphisms. This is why, at the approach of the mind, the absolute flees from the mind. Its approach is a mirage. Probably, however, the successful elimination of any anthropomorphism, the elimination with which the delusive content seems removed, coincides in the end with that context, with absolute identity. Denying the mystery by identification, by ripping more and more scraps out of it, does not resolve it. Rather, as though in play, the mystery belies our control of nature by reminding us of the impotence of our power. Enlightenment leaves practically nothing of the metaphysical content of truth, presque rien, or presque rien, to use a modern musical term. That which recedes keeps getting smaller and smaller, as Goethe describes it in the parable of New Melusine's box, designating an extremity. It grows more and more insignificant. This is why in the critique of cognition, as well as in the philosophy of history, metaphysics immigrates into micrology. Micrology is the place where metaphysics finds a haven from totality. No absolute can be expressed otherwise than in topics and categories of immanence, although neither in its conditionality nor as its totality is immanence to be deified. According to its own concept, metaphysics cannot be a deductive context of judgments about things and being, and neither can it be conceived after the model of an absolute otherness, terribly deifying thought. It would be possible only as a legible constellation of things in being, from those who would get the material without which it would not be. It would not transfigure the existence of its elements, however, but would bring them into a configuration in which the elements unite. Excuse me, pressed the wrong button. In which the elements unite to form a script. To that end, metaphysics must know how to wish. That the wish is a poor father to the thought has been one of the general theses of European enlightenment ever since Xenophanes. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Xenophanes. And the thesis applies undiminished to the attempts to restore ontology. But thinking itself a mode of conduct contains the need, the vital need at the outset, in itself. The need is what we think from, even where we disdain wishful thinking. The motor of the need is the effort that involves thought as action. The object of critique is not the need in thinking, but the relationship between the two. Yet the need in thinking is what makes us think. It asks us to be negated by thinking. It must disappear in thought if it is to be really satisfied. And in this negation it survives. Represented in the inmost cell of thought is that which is unlike thought. The smallest intramundane traits would be of relevance to the absolute. For the micrological view cracks the shell of what, measured by the subsuming cover concept, is helplessly isolated and explodes its identity, the delusion that it is but a specimen. There is a solidarity between such thinking and metaphysics at the time of its fall. And that is the end of Chapter 3 of Part 3 of Adorno's Negative Dialectics. Again, Part 3 was titled Models, and Chapter 3 of Part 3 was titled Meditations on Metaphysics. That is also the end of Negative Dialectics. Thank you so much for listening to anyone who has made it all the way through this book. I don't know myself what I got out of reading it, but it's referenced all the time, so I felt like I had to be a big boy and take a stab at it, even though it scared me. So I'm proud of myself for reading Negative Dialectics, even though it might have been, didn't really have the kind of like a philosophical experience to really cash in on a lot of the things that I was reading here. But hopefully, for those of you with a deeper background in Kant and Hegel and so forth, we're able to really suck the juices from this. Thank you so much.